people may have seen the attack on the Irish Health Service the other week. What you see there is missed appointments, you see dropped surgery, you see missing patient records. The impacts of that are huge. You really are talking a life and death impact.
That was Matt Palmer, head of Jersey's new cyber firefighting unit, CERT, the Computer Emergency Response Team. This is the Bailiwick Podcast, and I'm news editor Fiona Potney. Cyber warfare is getting serious. Once upon a time, hacking attempts were largely conducted by bedroom dwellers hoping to make a quick buck from their IT skills by tricking people into dishing their bank details. By 2017, Jersey's government was getting hit by around 500 high-level cyber attacks every day, while some island entities were getting hit by 4,000 or more. Hackers and other digi-criminals have only got stronger since then, and many of them care less about cash and more about grabbing data and poking holes in national security with a political aim in mind. Last month, Ireland's health service fell victim to an international ransomware attack, described as its most significant to date, while the largest petroleum pipeline in the US was reportedly breached as a result of a single leaked password. As the threat heightens, Jersey is preparing itself by pouring millions into cybersecurity infrastructure and setting up a fourth emergency service, CERT. Not only will it be firefighting when a cyber crisis breaks out, but it will be giving guidance and advice to smaller businesses. Most importantly, it will be tasked with finding and plugging the gaps in Jersey's national security, shoring up the island's key infrastructure and, crucially, its financial services, which make up more than a third of the economy. The man leading and building that team is Matt Palmer, who has 20 years' experience in the sector. I started by asking him how threats have changed since the millennium bug of the year 2000.
Yeah, so the millennium bug ages me perfectly because I just missed that one.
Okay.
That was just as I sort of left university, really, was the turn of the millennium. So when I came in, for the first few years of my career was spent working in general IT, and then I sort of moved into information security as a new field. Was very much a new field at the time. So the organisation I was working at the time, Skipton Building Society, most financial services institutions now would have an information security function that'd be quite mature. Even in that type of organisation at the time, it was pretty new. So it was very much everyone trying to understand what the challenges were, how to respond to it, and putting in place basic controls that today would look very different.
So what type of threats might you have been dealing with at the time, or challenges?
Well, a lot of it was very basic. So making sure that people, have the correct accounts to log on to, that computers are up to date, and these sorts of things. And of course, you have backups. We see today what happens when you don't. And the interesting thing is, many of those same basics are just as true today as they were 20 years ago. In fact, I think just as true today as they were 50 years ago. I think what's really changed isn't really how we respond to cybersecurity so much as the threat itself. So when I started out, we were really dealing with amateur hackers, maybe attacking systems for fun, and of course people making mistakes, or companies not putting in place just sensible controls. Where we are now, the world has moved on a great deal, and cybersecurity, which wasn't even a term back then, that's now a big thing. And we talk about nation-state attacks. We talk about the roles of Russia and China and other countries in this, the roles of the US and the UK, and really as a sort of geopolitical football as well as a real practical day-to-day issue. And that is a big change, because what we see organised crime getting involved. We see large amounts of effort put in. So if I give you a really practical example, 20 years ago, if you received a phishing email, which is an email from someone trying to persuade you to click on a link or download some malware to your computer, that would probably be an amateur-written email saying, something about, an inheritance from Nigeria, or someone lost in Spain who's forgotten their passport.
Someone in a bedroom somewhere.
That's it. It's someone in a bedroom copying an email, very often with typos and errors, and sending out thousands on the off chance that they'll be successful. In recent years, what I've seen is advanced attackers put months or years of effort into compromising a particular organisation or individual with really quite sophisticated, attacks and amounts of work going into that. So they'll put considerable resources into achieving something. They'll target you intentionally. And as a result, it's much, much harder to defend against it. And of course, the impacts are bigger now as well. So the other side of it, you've got this increased threat, but you've also got bigger impacts. So 20 years ago, we were talking about maybe data loss or perhaps the loss of some photos on someone's computer. And whilst that hurts and it's personal and it's often very distressing, what we're seeing today, so you may have noticed, people may have seen the attack on the Irish Health Service the other week. What you see there is missed appointments, you see dropped surgery, you see missing patient records. The impacts of that are huge. You really are talking a life and death impact, because I don't know about you, but I do not want to miss, a heart surgery or a cancer appointment because of a cyber attack. And this just wasn't the case in the past. So it's changed. Those have changed incredibly. And that, I think, is why it's now such a serious issue and why everybody has to sit up and pay attention. In the past, you could maybe let this go and hope it wouldn't impact you. That's really no longer a viable position to take. It's as fundamental as anything else. And basic precautions, really, the same as looking before you cross the road. It really is in that category, because cyber is something that impacts us every day.
Absolutely. And you sort of talked about people in their bedrooms might have been coming up with emails back in the day, sort of suggesting you're in for an inheritance. The objective then was always money. It sounds like one of the biggest parts is that we're looking at security, more national security, as you say, and the political threat as well. Is that a big change?
It is a big change. So I think there were two reasons why people did this a long time ago. One was for fun, or for interest, or just because it was the only thing to do, or people were trying to learn new skills. And the other one, of course, is for money or reward. Money and reward, and personal interest are still drivers behind bad behaviour today. Perhaps personal interest less so, because there are lots of good, legitimate jobs in cybersecurity. You don't have to be a bad guy to make a career out of it, and that's a big difference. What has happened, though, is as it's become clear that information is as powerful as anything else in the world, and that you can have a huge impact through influencing public opinion, or through disabling systems or services. This has reached the attention of nation states, who quite rightly see it as something that they needs to be part of their defensive arsenal. It would be wrong not to do that, and you can see that in the UK with the National Centre for Cybersecurity, and in military terms a joint cyber unit to protect the country. You also see it in terms of what's called offensive security, and that's going out and actively attacking people, either for national security reasons or because you want to find out who's been attacking you, and that is a growing risk. But actually, what tends to impact businesses and individuals isn't the normal behaviours of nation states engaging in disputes, disagreements, and geopolitics. It's what happens when this moves into the area of criminals and cyber attackers who maybe see themselves as supporting a national objective but are really acting independently. And we see a lot of that. So going back through my experience, things like NotPetya and WannaCry a few years ago, which took down large parts of the National Health Service, as well as huge companies. Like Maersk alone suffered a $300 million hit from one of those, and that was really an immense credit to them, because they had a high degree of readiness and worked very hard to recover. Otherwise, who knows what the impact would have been. These have a much bigger impact on individuals, on the community, and in fact on businesses than the sort of attacks that we've seen in the past. So it really raises the game, and it forces everyone to focus and say, okay, it's not about just the day-to-day, what's going to happen today or tomorrow. Is an individual computer going to be compromised? It's what's the impact if something like this happens tomorrow? And a lot of people look at that and say, okay, well, How much impact did that really have? And the answer is it really had a huge impact. We don't always feel it, but a missed medical appointment or a company going out of business or these sorts of things, they are huge. But actually, we did get lucky. So we found ways to deal with and respond to those attacks so they were disabled and we could recover. We can't assume that's going to be the case unless we put work into it. So it's a huge amount of effort that's required across many organisations to lead, coordinate and respond to what's now a very complex environment.
Let's just go into a bit of detail about some of the more kind of recent threats that we see emerging. So can you talk us through things like ransomware, for example, how that functions, and whaling as well?
Yes. So it's a very topical one is ransomware. This, of course, is what happened in all three of the examples I've mentioned. So WannaCry and NotPetya a few years ago, and also the Irish health service attack a few weeks ago. And if you follow the news, you may have spotted Colonial Pipeline in the United States, where they cut off the energy supply as a result of this. And you can really see the impacts of it. To a lot of people, however, it doesn't seem to make an awful lot of sense, and it can be quite difficult to understand what it is and how it happens and what impact it can have. So fundamentally, all that's happening here is somebody is trying to gain access to your computer and they're succeeding. And usually that's because you've clicked on a link in an email, you've downloaded an attachment, you've downloaded something off the internet or something like that. And it can be really hard to identify whether these are legitimate emails, legitimate links and downloads or not. It's a difficult thing to do. And what happens when that software gets onto your computer is the attacker can then use it to take control of your computer and encrypt all your data to make it unreadable. It's rather like sort of shredding newspapers. The newspaper was readable before, it's not readable afterwards, and you can't possibly put it back together. And that often, that's actually a very good analogy because, in many of these, they then demand a ransom, which is a payment of Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. At that point, everybody gets very confused very often. Most people wouldn't even know how to go about making a payment in Bitcoin, and so most people wouldn't try. I think the really sad thing is that for those who do try to pay a ransom, it often doesn't result in the return of data. Generally, I would say don't pay ransoms if this happens to you. But much better advice is try and make sure it doesn't happen to you by taking sensible precautions. So with all of these, even though it sounds complicated, even though it sounds sophisticated, and even though it can sound actually quite scary, there are sensible things that you can do to stop yourself from being, impacted by it. And there are things like, setting good passwords, not reusing passwords, using something called two-factor authentication, which I can explain if you would like me to. So two-factor authentication, this is a step forward from passwords. So a password protects your data because there's something you know, and the attacker doesn't know it. So without knowing that piece of information, they can't access your computer. The problem is not all passwords are safe and secure. A lot of people use things like their mother's maiden name or the names of their children or the month of the year or common things like this. If I've just mentioned your password, now might be a time to change it. I've made these mistakes in the past as well. Yeah, they're not uncommon. It's normal human behaviour to use words that we would remember. The problem is that or other attacks can make it easy for attackers to get that password, either through just trying time and time again, or by looking you up on social media, trying to understand a bit about you and guessing what those passwords are. When we talk about two-factor authentication, that's having something that a password, but also something you have or something that you are. So something you have might be a mobile phone, which you receive an SMS message out. You then put the code from the SMS message into the website in order to confirm that it's you. And or it might be an app such as a Microsoft or Google Authenticator app that's even better. Again, you get a code on your mobile phone and you put that in to confirm that it's you. And the nice thing about these things is it makes it much, much harder for an attacker to compromise your device. So if there's one piece of advice that people should take away, it is please use two-factor authentication because it's the single most effective control at the moment.
Let's just for a second talk about data breaches when they do occur, particularly to small businesses.
Yes.
A lot of them might be quite nervous to report that something's gone wrong because, maybe that reveals that that there's been a hole in whatever processes they have currently. I mean, how do we get around that if people are a bit scared to say something's gone wrong, I need to address this?
It's a real difficulty, actually, because sometimes people can be a bit embarrassed about the fact that it's happened to them. In that case, I'd say, there's no point being embarrassed that it happens to you because it pretty much happens to everybody. They can also be a bit reticent to come forward because sometimes businesses in particular are worried about the legal or reputational damage that might be incurred. And once something gets into a legal environment or a sort of PR environment, it can be really difficult actually to work out how best to respond. It's not always easy. I mean, Talk a few years ago are a good example of putting a lot of effort into trying to communicate right, and they got nothing but criticism for it. So it's reasonable for businesses to be concerned about how they deal with these things. What I can say is it's generally better to be transparent. There are expectations that you would share information with people who have been impacted so they can do something about it. And if you don't do that in a timely manner, that can cause you legal problems, but more importantly, it can cost you customers. And it can cause real concern for consumers and people at home who are worried what's happened to my data, what's happened to my account. Should I be worried about my bank accounts or my photos or whatever else it happens to be? And I think the important thing is to do your best to communicate openly and transparently and to help people with those hurdles. So if people have been impacted, try and give them sound and solid advice as to how best to respond. And if they don't have to worry, tell them, but you can still tell them what's happened. And if you need some help or advice with this is where we'd encourage businesses to get in touch, because this is part of the value that having a cyber emergency response team brings. Part of it, of course, is dealing with an incident when it happens. Part of it is that preparedness and that readiness. So what I would say to businesses, if you're not sure how you would respond if this happens, now might be a really good time to sit down and start planning that out. Run your own incident readiness exercise. Say, what if this happened to me? And work out how you would respond. And if you're stuck, if you don't know the answers, there are people you can turn to for help, whether that's the CERT or whether that's private security providers or whoever else. There's a wealth of information out there. But being prepared in advance will really help you when this happens to you. And and don't be afraid of sharing. One of the really sort of interesting comparisons here is aviation. In the aviation industry, it's normal to share information on incidents, whether it's a near miss or whether it's something that's actually happened. You're expected to share this, and it's normal, and people don't worry about it. If we could get there in cyber, where it's normal to share that there was a near miss, or it's normal to share that there was an incident, at the very least with the CERT or with law enforcement professionals, if it's a criminal matter. Then that'll make us all stronger, because once we know this information, we can help everyone to defend and protect against it.
So let's just sort of chunk it up a level then. We've sort of spoken about individual businesses, but looking at Jersey generally and its infrastructure, what areas could possibly be vulnerable to cybersecurity threats, and what can we do about those at that higher sort of government level?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting time for governments and public sector organisations, because what's happening not just in Jersey but everywhere in the world is a process of digitalisation. So whereas in the past files might have been in filing cabinets, now they're on computers. And whereas in the past we might have walked in and spoken to somebody about an issue we've got, now it tends to be digital communications, whether that's email or online. And that does raise the game in terms of cybersecurity. So when we look at this, it's things like, tax records, healthcare records, or, the resilience of fire and police services and critical infrastructure to be able to handle and respond. You've got issues in, we saw an incident in the US a few weeks ago where hackers managed to change the settings on a water plant and actually effectively poison the water supply. These are issues for every organisation to grapple with, public and private sector, and they are really hard things to do. So in order to do that, not only does each individual organisation have to have good cyber controls, but we have to have coordination and leadership across the lot, and work together to solve some of these problems, because cyber incidents, they don't happen in a vacuum. They happen because organisations are working together, because they're exposed to the world. and really raising the standards there in terms of the level of protection given to systems, the level of resilience that we have. These are really important things to do, and there is a lot of technology out there, a lot of capabilities out there that will help us do this, but modernisation and digitalisation, they're not optional things, and they are raising the game for everybody, so those risks are significant. In addition to that, of course, you have Jersey is unique because it does have, for example, a large financial services sector, which poses its own risks. One of the nice things about financial services is they tend to be some of the more mature organisations, and certainly open to sharing and open to help. So, that helps us with this, but it's still, it's a big area to deal with in terms of reputational risk. In the past, we've always had great support in terms of legal services, in terms of infrastructure to help protect the reputation of the island. The reputation of the island is now incredibly closely tied to cybersecurity, so we need to get this right, or we do run the risk of incidents that will cause people to lose confidence in us as a jurisdiction, in major organisations within Jersey, or so on. And I think responding to that risk, making sure that we protect our international reputation, as well as having the practical capabilities to deal with an incident, those are going to be absolutely critical.
So is it fair to say we're kind of moving into a space where, looking at cyber, it's almost like a fourth emergency service? Would CERT be sort of the cyber firefighters, I suppose, where you're looking at this threat as it develops in future?
It is actually, cyber response often is compared to a fire service, because in many ways it's very similar, in that it takes a huge amount of expertise and capability to be able to respond when something does happen, but most of the work is in preparedness. So your fire service is only effective because they train every single day, day in, day out. And they have plans to deal with every scenario that they think might occur. The challenge that we have in cyber is to get to the same point. So at the moment we have isolated pockets of capability, and we do have some good controls, and we have some organisations, including government, who are investing heavily in this area. But what we don't have is that level of maturity that we'd expect from the fire service or the police in discharging their duties. And to get there, we really need to get to that point where we are prepared for anything that we think can happen. We have the capabilities to respond to it. We know what we're going to do when things go wrong. And we can be calm and collected and not panic when they do. That's going to take some work and some coordination, and the CERT will be looking at what activities that we can undertake, particularly across areas like critical national infrastructure, which is fire, police, telecoms, and so on, ports, these sorts of organisations, in order to really help make sure that we have that ability to respond, that we are ready, that we have a group of trained professionals there who can be called upon in an emergency.
So you're going to be leading that team. Tell me, what other kind of key roles do you need on that team, and how confident are you that you'll be able to find that expertise on the island?
Finding these skills in Jersey is a challenge. It's always been a challenge. About 10 years ago, I co-founded something called the Channel Islands Information Security Forum, and the reason I got involved in that was I'd come to Jersey in a manager role, and I rapidly realised that it was going to be difficult to hire a replacement or indeed colleagues without hiring off island. And of course we want to hire locally if we possibly can into all cyber roles, whether they are in the CERT or elsewhere. We need that level of capability. We still don't, I believe, have the level of cyber capability that we need across the island. There's a real need for some capacity building and skills development and providing these resources so there are enough qualified people for all the businesses and organisations that need them. So I'm not expecting it to be an easy task. What I do think is we do have some very good skills in Jersey, and we are going to have a small and lean organisation, which is going to make it in some ways a challenge to find the right skills, but it also means we can look at the skills that are out there and find the right balance of skills. And we're not going to be afraid of training either. I'm not expecting that we'll find the skills in incident response that we need on day one everywhere. So we'll be looking at how do we develop skills within a CERT, and how do we support the rest of industry to have the skilled cyber professionals that they need as well. What I would say though is I'm very keen to hear from professionals in Jersey who maybe have an interest and experience in cyber and have that public spiritedness, that desire to really have an impact across the community, because those are the key things that we're going to be looking for here. You really have to want to do it. It is going to be a really interesting and dynamic role, but it's also going to be at times difficult and challenging. So I'll be looking for the right people, and I have every confidence that we'll find them in Jersey if we work to do it, and to build skills and to build capability all across the sector.
So at first this is going to be part of a government department, it'll be under
That's
economy,
right.
but it may be the case that it turns into an arm's length organisation. What would be the advantage of that?
Well, I think the key role of a CERT is to be a critical friend. So what I mean by that is, we're there to hold to account and to ensure effective delivery of cyber, and where necessary to stand up, put our hands up and say, actually, this isn't working or this can be done better. And to do that, it helps to have a degree of independence from the organisations that we are talking to, in the same way that an auditor would be independent from a company. There are lots of different ways of delivering that, and one of my priorities over the next sort of 6 months or so is going to be talking to a wide range of stakeholders, both in business, in industry, in government, and across the public sector, to really understand how that remit can be effectively delivered.
In kind of practical terms, what might the outputs of CERT be that the community might see and be able to learn from?
Well, I think the first thing I have to say is we're not going to breach any confidences. We want people to feel able to come and talk to us about issues, knowing that we're going to keep that confidence and look at the lessons that can be learned from it and share those. What we absolutely expect to be doing is sharing the lessons learned. So if we have, for example, let's suppose tomorrow an organisation in Jersey is subject to a targeted phishing attack or something like that. We have whaling, you mentioned, which is a phishing attack or similar that targets a high-profile individual or a particularly sort of important role. These are very common. What we then want to do is understand whether that's likely to affect other organisations in Jersey. We look at whether we can learn from it, what we can tell people about how these things happen so that they can spot these attacks before they happen or when they happen to them. And to, of course, to alert people to ongoing attacks and threats so that people are aware that, if we're seeing attacks from a particular, IP address, which is a digital location or something like that, that information is available. So we'll definitely be looking at data sharing. There are already some data sharing mechanisms in place, and we'll be looking to enhance and develop and communicate those and make sure that those deliver real practical value.
What can we be doing, for example, with children today that might enable them to have this sort of cybersecurity, cyber resilience in their minds from the get-go? Because obviously this is something that many of us are having to almost learn about now, having to play catch-up on.
It's really important, and one of the reasons that we have an issue today is that those of us in the workforce now, many of us weren't taught this stuff as we were growing up because it wasn't an issue. We just didn't have connected computers. I remember the first time I saw a computer. I very much doubt my children will remember that. It'll be like, would you remember the first time you saw a motor vehicle? No, you wouldn't. And I've got two kids, they're 9 and 12, and I think what I take heart from is they both have a level of awareness of these issues. And will ask about these issues, and they are increasingly conscious of the issues involved in social media, for example, and where you share information, and the fact that there are bad people out there as well as good, and a degree of caution is needed online as well as just as you would if you were going for a trip to the park. So I think some basis of awareness is there. I think the challenge is how do we develop and teach it, and I think that is something that we need to get to grips with, as a community, and in fact across the world. There are very few examples of really great cybersecurity education at primary level. What there are some really good initiatives. So several cybersecurity bodies already have initiatives to do this, and there are organisations in Jersey who are already working on and looking at this. And I know that many schools and school teachers are also aware of these issues and actively teaching them to children. So there's not a vacuum there. There are reasons to be positive, but there's always more that can be done. And I think addressing that issue and helping children understand how those core lessons of keeping yourself safe online then translate into being an adult and what they do in the workplace and how they behave at work and how they look after other people's data as that responsibility increases. That's really important. I think a lot of the issues that we've seen in recent years where we're talking about, sharing photos or children accessing inappropriate websites or, online stalkers and these sorts of things, they're real issues that we need to get to grips with. And many are getting to grips with, the police have a role here and everybody. But they're also sending us a message, which is this is something that is not going to go away. These issues were not there when we were young. Yeah, when I was young, there was no need to have a conversation about any of these issues. They are there today, and today's children, they are going to live with those issues their whole lives. So we need to deal with that. It's not just about hard controls, though. It's about you can be a lot more vulnerable when your life is online. And it's really important that when we go about things, so when we share pictures of our children and things like that, we also stop and think, actually, this could be out there for the rest of their lives. How comfortable am I that they would want me to share this information, that they would want me to do this? When we share information online, could this be used in an attack against me? It's not nice to have to think about these things, but in the same way that you wouldn't leave your car keys and your wallet on the dashboard of your car, you have to think about what exposing your life online is going to do. There is a risk there, and there are precautions that can be taken. You may choose, you just constantly choose, I think, how much you want to share. And people can have these conversations at home as well as at school. So I have these conversations with my kids. In fact, more likely they have the conversation with me and ask the questions, which is great. But it's a conversation we all need to have. It's not just one for the education community.